In the kind of town where everyone knows your business before you've even lived it. A man named Elric Voss showed up one spring morning with a beat-up pickup truck, a duffel bag, and a look in his eyes that said he'd already made up his mind about something no one else understood. He wasn't new to the area exactly. He'd grown up just 20 miles down the road in a farmhouse that had long since collapsed under the weight of time and neglect. But he hadn't been back in over a decade. People remembered him vaguely. Quiet kid, good with engines. Always had grease under his fingernails and a dog trailing behind him. But that was before he left for the city, before the years of odd jobs, before the silence that followed his return. Now, at 38, Elric wasn't chasing fame or fortune. He wasn't running from the law or nursing a broken heart, at least not in the dramatic way people imagined. He was just tired of renting rooms in buildings that smelled like stale cigarettes and regret, tired of waking up to sirens and strangers shouting through thin walls, tired of feeling like he was always passing through life instead of actually living in it. So when he saw the old train car sitting on a patch of scrubland just outside town, rusted, roof sagging, windows boarded up with warped plywood, he didn't see junk. He saw possibility. The train car had been there for as long as most folks could remember. It belonged to the old rail line that shut down in the 1970s. And over the years it had become a dumping ground for everything from broken appliances to expired fireworks. Teenagers used it as a hangout spot until the floor started giving way, and even the raccoons had stopped nesting in it. It leaned slightly to the left like it was bowing out of shame. The paint, what little remained, was a dull maroon bleached pale by decades of sun. Weeds grew right up to its wheels, which were fused to the tracks by rust and time. When Elric walked into the county clerk's office and asked about buying it, the clerk blinked twice and said, "You mean that old hulk by Miller's Field? Ain't worth $5, son." "I'll take it," Elric said, and handed over the last of his savings, won $200, earned from rebuilding transmissions in a garage 2 states over. Word spread fast. By lunchtime, half the town knew Elric Voss had bought the ghost train. By dinner, they were placing bets on how long it would take him to give up. At the diner over coffee and pie, folks chuckled about it like it was a sitcom plot. "He's gonna live in that thing?" asked Old Man Hargrove, stirring his coffee with a bent spoon. "That thing's got more holes than my granddaddy's socks." Someone else joked that Elric must have lost a bet. Another said maybe he was writing a book and needed atmosphere. No one considered that he might actually be serious. But Elric didn't care what they thought. He'd learned long ago that opinions were like weather, always changing, rarely helpful. What mattered was what you did with your hands and your time. So the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, he backed his truck up to the train car, tied a thick rope around its front coupler, and began the slow, groaning work of dragging it 50 yards off the old track and onto a slightly flatter patch of land he'd cleared with a borrowed machete. It took him 3 days just to get it level. He propped it up with cinder blocks and railroad ties he found half buried in the dirt. Every muscle in his body ached, but he kept going. He didn't have power tools. Didn't have a crew. Didn't even have a proper hammer. Just a claw hammer with a cracked handle he'd picked up at a yard sale for $1. But he had patience, and he had a plan, though he never wrote it down or told anyone about it. Not yet. The first real sign that he was actually moving in came when he hauled an old mattress through the side door he'd pried open with a crowbar. It was stained and lumpy, but clean. He'd scrubbed it himself with baking soda and vinegar. That same week, he installed a salvaged window from a demolished schoolhouse. Glass intact, frame painted white. It looked out of place against the rust, but somehow right. Like a single clear eye in a weathered face, people started watching. Not openly, of course. They'd drive by slowly, pretending to check their mail or admire the wildflowers. Kids on bikes would stop at the edge of the property, whispering and pointing. One afternoon, a woman walking her poodle paused at the fence and called out, "You planning to turn that into a chicken coop or something?" Elric wiped his brow with the back of his hand and gave a small smile. "Something like that." She nodded, unsure, and walked on. But the story grew. By the weekend, it wasn't just curiosity. It was entertainment. A few teenagers snuck onto the property one night and spray-painted "Home Sweet Hole" on the side. Elric found it the next morning. He didn't get angry. He just sanded it off, then painted over the whole section with a can of dark green enamel he'd mixed himself from leftover house paint. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. Then came the dog. No one knew where it came from. One day it wasn't there. The next, it was curled up under the train car, ribs showing, one ear torn, left hind leg dragging slightly. It didn't bark when Elric approached, just watched him with wary amber eyes. Elric left out a bowl of water and some leftover stew. The dog didn't touch it until Elric walked away. But the next morning the bowl was empty, and the dog was still there. Elric named him Switch. Not because of the injury, but because old railroaders used to say a switch was where paths changed direction. And something about this dog, this train, this moment, it all felt like a switch had been thrown in his life. From drifting to deciding, from silence to purpose. He built a small lean-to beside the train car out of scrap wood and tarps, just big enough for Switch to sleep under when it rained. He patched the dog's wounds with antiseptic and bandages from the dollar store. Slowly, Switch began to trust him. He'd follow Elric around the property, tail low but wagging, ears perked at every sound. When Elric worked, Switch lay nearby, chin on paws, watching like a silent partner. Still, the town talked. At the post office, at the gas station, at church socials, they couldn't understand why a grown man would choose to live in a metal box on wheels when there were perfectly good apartments available. "He's got to be off his rocker," someone muttered at the hardware store when Elric tried to buy nails and hinges. The clerk, a man named Dale who'd known Elric's father, frowned and said, "You sure you know what you're doing, son? That thing's a death trap. Roof could cave in, floor's rotten, and in winter, you'll freeze solid." "I've been colder," Elric said simply. Dale studied him for a long moment, then sighed and rang up the purchase. "Just don't expect us to come dig you out when it all falls apart." Elric didn't argue. He loaded his supplies into the truck, gave Switch a pat on the head, and drove back to the train car. That night, as a thunderstorm rolled in, he sat inside with a kerosene lantern flickering on the floor, listening to the rain drum against the metal roof. It sounded like 1,000 tiny footsteps. Switch pressed close to his leg, warm and steady. For the first time in years, Elric felt calm. Not happy, not excited, just calm. Like he'd finally stopped running and could breathe. Over the next few weeks, he replaced the worst of the floorboards with pallet wood he'd sanded smooth. He patched holes in the walls with sheet metal and caulk. He rigged a tarp over the roof to keep the rain out until he could find proper roofing material. He carried buckets of water from the creek half a mile away because there was no plumbing. He cooked on a camp stove. He used a composting toilet he built himself from a plastic bin and sawdust. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his, and then something unexpected happened. One morning he found a drawing tucked under the door. It was a crayon sketch of a train, bright red with smiling windows and a stick figure standing beside it with a dog. At the bottom, in wobbly letters, "For the train man." No name. Just the drawing. Elric stared at it for a long time. Then he taped it to the inside wall right by the window. The next week, another drawing appeared. This one showed the train with books inside and a sun in the corner. Then came a small potted plant left on the steps, just a sprig of mint in a yogurt cup. Then a thermos of soup still warm with a note, "From Marnie. Eat before it gets cold." Marnie was the retired school teacher who lived 3 streets over. She'd never spoken to Elric, but she'd watched him from her porch with quiet curiosity. Unlike the others, she didn't assume he was foolish. She'd seen enough in her 60 years to know that sometimes the strangest choices come from the deepest wisdom. Still, most of the town held their judgment. They waited for him to fail, for the rain to flood the train, for the wind to rip the roof off, for him to pack up and leave, tail between his legs, just like everyone expected. But Elric didn't leave. He kept working. Every day a little more. A shelf here, a curtain there, a coat of paint on the door. He scavenged materials from construction sites, thrift stores, and roadside cleanups. He traded labor for supplies, fixing a neighbor's lawnmower for a roll of insulation, helping an elderly couple move furniture for a box of old books. He never asked for handouts, but he accepted kindness when it came, always with a quiet thank you and a nod. Switch grew stronger. His limp lessened. His coat turned from dull brown to a rich, glossy chestnut. He barked now, not at strangers but at squirrels, at passing cars, at the wind when it howled too loud. He'd sit at the edge of the property like a sentry, proud and alert. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the train car began to look less like a ruin and more like a home. But no one knew why Elric was doing it. Not really. They saw a man fixing up a train car. They didn't see the notebooks filled with sketches hidden under his mattress. They didn't see the list of book titles he'd been collecting for years. They didn't hear the late-night thoughts he whispered to Switch about quiet spaces and safe corners and the way some kids just need a place where no one expects them to talk. All they saw was a rusty train car, and all they felt was amusement until one day, months later, when Elric opened the door and invited them inside. But that was still a long way off. For now, he was just the train man, the oddball on the edge of town who lived with a three-legged dog and talked to himself, the one they laughed about over coffee, the one their kids pointed to with wide eyes. They didn't know his story, didn't know about the years he spent working double shifts to care for his sick mother, about the nights he slept in his car after she passed, about the quiet grief that followed him like a shadow. They didn't know that this train car wasn't an escape, it was a return, a way to build something real in a world that felt increasingly unreal. And maybe that was okay, because sometimes the most important things begin in silence. Sometimes they begin with a man, a dog, and a rusted train car no one else wanted, and sometimes that's enough. The days stretched longer as summer deepened, and the train car, once a hunched silhouette against the field, began to stand a little taller. Elric worked with the kind of quiet focus that made time feel different around him. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just kept showing up, hammer in hand, coffee in a dented thermos, Switch trotting beside him like a shadow that had finally found its shape. Inside, the space was changing slowly but surely. Where there had been rot and rust, there was now smooth wood and clean lines. Elric had replaced the worst of the floorboards with sanded pallet planks, fitting them together like a puzzle only he understood. He'd lined the walls with old barnwood he'd hauled from a collapsed shed 10 miles out of town. Gray and weathered, but solid. It smelled like hay and rain, like memory. He didn't paint over it. He let it breathe. He'd also managed to install a small wood-burning stove, traded for by rewiring the electrical system in a neighbor's garage. It sat in the corner near what would become the kitchen area, its black iron gleaming in the lantern light. On cold nights, it filled the whole car with warmth that seeped into your bones. Switch loved it. He'd curl up right in front of it, sighing like a man who'd finally found peace. But the real magic wasn't in the structure, it was in the details. A shelf built from an old railroad tie held a mismatched collection of mugs, each one found at a different flea market. A curtain made from a faded quilt hung over the sleeping loft, giving just enough privacy without closing off the light. And near the window, the one with the white frame and clear glass, Elric had built a small reading nook. Just a cushion, a side table from a thrift store, and a lamp with a green glass shade that cast a soft golden glow. Still, most folks in town only saw the outside. They drove by, slowed down, maybe snapped a photo but never stopped. They figured Elric was just eccentric, maybe a little lost. Living in a train car? Who does that? But then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, something shifted. Marnie, the retired schoolteacher with silver hair and sharp eyes, pulled her old station wagon onto the dirt path leading to the train car. She didn't honk, didn't call out. She just parked, opened her umbrella, and walked over with a thermos in one hand and a paper bag in the other. Elric was on the roof, patching a leak with tar and scrap metal when he saw her. He climbed down slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans. Switch barked once, not aggressively, just to announce her, and then wagged his tail. "I brought soup," Marnie said, holding out the thermos, "and some bread, homemade." Elric hesitated, then took it. "Thank you," she nodded toward the train. "Mind if I take a look?" He didn't answer right away. For months he'd kept the inside to himself. It wasn't shame, it was protection. This space was fragile, not just in wood and nail, but in feeling. But something in Marnie's eyes told him she wouldn't laugh. She wouldn't mock. She'd seen enough classrooms, enough children, enough quiet struggles to recognize when someone was building more than just shelter. He stepped aside. Marnie walked in slowly, her boots clicking softly on the new floor. She didn't say much at first. She ran her fingers along the shelves, peered into the loft, knelt to check the stove. Then she turned to him, eyes bright. "You did all this yourself?" "Most of it," he said. "It's peaceful," she said, and the word landed like a stone in still water. They sat on the floor by the stove, sipping soup from mismatched mugs. Rain tapped gently on the roof. Switch lay between them, head on his paws. Marnie asked questions, not nosy ones, but curious. "Where'd he get the wood?" How'd he manage the insulation? Did he have plans to add electricity? Elric answered simply, honestly. He told her about trading labor for materials, about nights spent sketching layouts by lantern light, about how he'd learned to solder pipes from a YouTube video and a library book. He didn't brag. He didn't complain. He just told it like it was. And then quietly he said, "I'm not just fixing it up to live in." Marnie waited. "I want it to be a place," he said, looking down at his hands. "A quiet place. For kids who don't have one." She didn't ask for more. She didn't need to. She'd taught for 32 years. She knew what he meant. The kids who flinched at loud voices. The ones who stared out windows during class, lost in storms no one else could see. The ones who carried silence like a second skin. She nodded. "You're building a harbor." He looked up, surprised. "Yeah, I guess I am." That visit changed things, not all at once, but like a stone dropped in a pond, the ripples spread. A few days later, Marnie returned with a box of books. Not textbooks. Not workbooks. Real books. The Phantom Toll Booth. Charlotte's Web. Where the Wild Things Are. For the shelves, she said. Start small. Elric placed them carefully on the reading nook shelf. They looked right there like they'd been waiting. Then something even quieter happened. The children started coming, not in groups, not with parents. Just one or two at a time on bikes or on foot, lingering at the edge of the property like they weren't sure they were allowed. Elric never called out to them. He just left the door open a crack and went about his work. Sometimes he'd leave out a bowl of water and a few dog biscuits, not for Switch, but for whoever might stop by. One afternoon, a girl with braids and scuffed sneakers stood at the steps for nearly 10 minutes before finally knocking. Elric opened the door. She didn't say anything, just held out a drawing, a train with stars coming out of the chimney. He took it, smiled, and taped it next to the others on the wall. "Thanks," he said. She nodded and ran off. The next week, she came back. This time, she brought a friend. They sat on the steps eating apples, watching Switch chase a butterfly. Elric stayed inside, giving them space. But he left the door open wider. Word spread among the kids like a secret code. There's a train. It's not scary. There's a dog. The man doesn't talk much, but he listens. Adults noticed. At first, they were wary. Is that safe? Who is he really? But when they saw their kids coming home calmer, quieter, sometimes even smiling after a visit to the train, their suspicions softened. One mother, whose son had been struggling with nightmares since his parents' divorce, asked Elric if he'd mind if the boy sat inside for a while after school. He says it's the only place he doesn't feel loud inside. Elric said yes. He started keeping a small basket by the door with noise-canceling headphones, stress balls, and blank journals. He didn't force anyone to use them. He just made them available. And kids did. Meanwhile, the train car kept evolving. Elric installed a small solar panel on the roof, enough to power a single LED light and charge a phone. He built a rainwater collection system using gutters and food-grade barrels. He planted herbs and old coffee cans along the steps, mint, thyme, rosemary. Small things, human things. One Saturday, a teenager named Leo, who'd been in and out of trouble since middle school, showed up with a backpack and a wary look. He didn't say why he was there, just leaned against the fence, arms crossed. Elric didn't push. He handed him a wrench and said, "If you're bored, I could use help tightening the porch bolts." Leo stayed for 3 hours. Didn't talk much. But he came back the next weekend, and the next people began to stop by, not to gawk, but to see. A retired carpenter offered to help reinforce the loft. A librarian donated a box of gently used paperbacks. Even the hardware store owner, Dale, showed up one morning with a bag of screws and a gruff, "Heard you could use these." Elric accepted it all with the same quiet gratitude, but the real turning point came on a warm August evening. A boy named Eli, 10 years old, thin as a reed, eyes too old for his face, had been coming by every few days. He never spoke. Not a word. His teacher had mentioned he hadn't said anything in class all year. His mother said he used to talk in full sentences, sing in the shower, laugh at cartoons. But something had shut down inside him after his older brother moved away for college. Now he moved through the world like a ghost. That evening, Eli sat in the reading nook flipping through a picture book about trains. Switch lay at his feet. Elric was across the room, sanding a shelf. The only sounds were the hum of crickets and the soft rustle of pages. Then out of nowhere, Eli looked up and said, clear as morning light, "This train has a library?" Elric froze. Not because of the words, but because of the voice. Soft, hesitant, but real, he turned slowly. "It will," he said. "Soon." Eli nodded, then went back to his book. But something had shifted. In that moment, the train car stopped being just a project. It became a promise. News of Eli's words spread, not as gossip, but as wonder. The kid who hadn't spoken in months said something inside that train. People started to look at Elric differently, not as a strange man living in junk, but as someone who'd built a space where healing could happen without fanfare, without pressure, without performance. More kids came. Not all of them needed silence. Some just needed somewhere to be that wasn't home, wasn't school, wasn't the noisy chaos of everywhere else. They'd sit on the steps, read comics, sketch in notebooks, or just watch the clouds roll by. Elric never charged them, never made rules beyond be kind, clean up after yourself, respect the quiet. He started keeping a small notebook by the door, not to track who came, but to write down book requests, more dragon books. Something about space. A story where the kid wins. He'd hunt for them at thrift stores, online sales, library discards. Each one placed on the shelf like a gift. One afternoon, Marnie brought over an old typewriter she'd found in her attic. "Thought it might belong here," she said. Elric set it on a small table near the window. Within a week, kids were typing poems, stories, even letters to their future selves. The clack-clack of keys became part of the train's rhythm. Switch, now healthy and strong, had become the unofficial greeter. He'd nudge hands with his nose, rest his head on laps, and sometimes, when a child was especially quiet, he'd curl up beside them like a living blanket. The town's laughter had faded. In its place was something quieter, deeper, respect. Not everyone understood it. Some still thought it was odd. But even the skeptics couldn't deny the change they saw in the kids who visited. Teachers noticed calmer classrooms. Parents reported better sleep, fewer outbursts, more eye contact. The train car wasn't a miracle. It was just a space, warm, safe, and full of quiet understanding. And Elric? He kept working. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He'd started sketching plans for a second shelf, a better rain catchment system, maybe even a small outdoor reading circle under a tree. He didn't rush. He let the vision unfold like a slow sunrise. One evening, as he sat on the steps with a cup of tea, Marnie pulled up again. She didn't bring soup this time. Just herself, you know, she said, sitting beside him. "You've done something rare." He looked at her. "You didn't wait for permission to help," she said. "You just built the thing that was missing." He smiled faintly. "I didn't build it alone." She patted his knee and stood to leave. As she walked back to her car, she glanced over her shoulder. Elric was watching the sunset, switch at his feet. The train car glowing in the golden light like it had always belonged there. And maybe it had. Because sometimes, the places we need most aren't found. They're made, with hands, with heart, and with the quiet courage to begin. The train car had a name now. Not one Elric had shouted from the rooftops or painted in bold letters, but one that slipped into town talk like a secret finally shared. The Wayfarer's Library. It started with a child, maybe Eli, maybe another, who told a friend, "You should go to the library in the train." And the name stuck, because it felt right. A wayfarer was someone passing through, someone searching, someone in need of rest. And this place, rusted and humble as it was, offered exactly that. By early fall, the inside of the train car no longer looked like a renovation project. It looked like a home that had opened its arms. Shelves lined both walls, filled not just with books, but with small treasures. Smooth river stones, hand-thrown pottery mugs, a wind-up music box that played a soft lullaby when wound. The reading nook had grown into a proper corner with a beanbag, a fleece blanket, and a small basket of fidget toys for restless hands. Above the loft, Elric had hung string lights powered by the solar panel, tiny stars that glowed when dusk fell. But the real change wasn't in the objects. It was in the rhythm of the days. After school, kids began showing up like clockwork. Some came alone. Others in pairs, whispering and giggling as they climbed the steps. Elric never turned anyone away, but he also never forced conversation. He'd be sanding a piece of wood, mending a book spine with tape, or brewing tea on the camp stove, and if someone wanted to talk, they would. If not, they'd curl up with a book or sketch in one of the donated notebooks. He started offering quiet tutoring sessions too. Not formal lessons, just help with homework if someone was stuck. He wasn't a teacher, but he'd been good at math and science once, and he remembered how confusing it could feel when no one slowed down to explain things clearly. A girl named Tessa, who struggled with fractions, came 3 afternoons a week. She'd sit at the small table near the stove, chewing her pencil, while Elric drew pies and slices in the margins of her notebook, until her eyes lit up with understanding. Then there was Leo, the teenager who'd first shown up looking for trouble but stayed because he found something else: purpose. He started helping Elric with repairs, learning how to patch leaks, level shelves, even wire a basic circuit. One day he brought his little sister along. She was shy, hiding behind his jacket, but when Switch trotted over and dropped a chewed tennis ball at her feet, she smiled. That was enough. Word of the train library reached the school, not through flyers or announcements, but through the kids themselves. A teacher noticed one of her students, who used to shut down during group work, volunteering to read aloud after spending time in the train. Another saw a boy with chronic anxiety sit through an entire lunch period without bolting, because he'd spent the morning in the breathing corner Elric had set up near the back. A cushion, a weighted lap pad, and a jar filled with glitter water that you could shake and watch settle. The school counselor, a woman named Dr. Lynn who'd worked in big city clinics before moving to the countryside for peace, asked if she could visit. Elric agreed. She came on a Tuesday, dressed in soft sweaters and quiet shoes, and spent an hour just observing. She watched a boy with ADHD focus for 20 minutes straight on building a model airplane at the table. She saw a girl who rarely made eye contact gently pet Switch while reading a book about wolves. She didn't take notes. She just absorbed. Before she left, she turned to Elric and said, "You've created a sensory sanctuary. Do you know that?" He shook his head. "I just wanted it to feel safe." "It does," she said. "More than most places I've seen." She asked if he'd be open to a partnership. Informal, no paperwork, just trust. The school could quietly refer students who needed a calm space after a rough day. No pressure to talk, no expectations. Just a place to reset. Elric thought about it for a long moment. He didn't want rules, didn't want bureaucracy, but he also knew some kids needed a bridge between school and peace. "Only if it stays quiet," he said. "No labels. No files, just if a kid needs to come, they come." Dr. Lynn agreed, and so it began. Soon, a few students started arriving during lunch breaks or right after the final bell, sent not with a note, but with a quiet nod from a teacher who'd learned to read the signs. Clenched fists, darting eyes, a voice gone too still. They'd walk the half-mile to the train car, sometimes alone, sometimes with a friend for courage. And every time Elric would be there, sweeping the floor, watering the herbs, or simply sitting with a book of his own, and he'd look up, give a small smile and say, "Doors open." No one was ever turned away. Not the kid who cried silently in the corner for an hour. Not the one who paced back and forth until the storm inside passed. Not the girl who just needed to sit next to Switch and breathe. And then came Maya. She was 13 with dark eyes that rarely left the ground and a backpack that looked too heavy for her frame. She'd been in and out of foster homes since she was 8. School was a minefield for her. Too loud, too fast, too full of people who didn't understand that silence wasn't rudeness, it was survival. She'd been suspended twice for defiance, though all she'd done was refuse to speak when cornered by a teacher demanding answers she wasn't ready to give. Dr. Lynn sent her to the train one afternoon, after Maya had shut down completely during a history quiz. She walked the path slowly, shoulders hunched, expecting judgment. But when she stepped inside, Elric didn't ask her name. Didn't ask what happened. He just pointed to the breathing corner and said, "Tea's hot if you want some." She sat, didn't drink the tea, didn't touch the blanket, but she stayed for 40 minutes. The next day she came back, and the next. After a week she picked up a journal from the basket and started writing. Not to anyone, just for herself. Pages and pages of messy script, sometimes angry, sometimes sad. Sometimes just lists of things that made her feel calm. Rain on metal, the smell of old paper, the way the dog sighs when he sleeps. One afternoon, she left the journal open on the table by accident. Elric saw it but didn't read it. Instead, he placed a new journal beside it, this one with a lock and a tiny key. He didn't say a word, but the next day Maya nodded at him, just once. That was thanks enough. Her visits became regular. She started helping shelve books, organizing them not by author or title but by feeling. Books for when you're angry held stories of rebellion and justice. Stories that feel like hugs were full of gentle adventures and loyal friends. For when the world is too loud featured quiet protagonists who found strength in stillness. Kids loved it. They'd come in, glance at the labels, and pick the shelf that matched their mood. Elric never took credit. He let the kids shape the space. When a boy asked for books about space, they appeared. When a girl wanted stories with girls who fixed engines, Elric hunted them down. He even started a wish shelf, a small chalkboard where anyone could write a book they hoped to find. Within days, it was full. A book where the kid saves the town. Something about ghosts but not scary. A story with a dog-like switch. Donations poured in, not just from townspeople, but from neighboring counties. A retired librarian sent boxes of classics. A bookstore in the next town over began setting aside gently used copies for the train project. Someone even mailed a handmade quilt with train tracks stitched into the pattern. Elric hung it over the loft like a canopy, but the most surprising shift came from the adults. At first, they'd kept their distance. But as they saw their children calmer, more present, even smiling after a visit to the train, curiosity turned to gratitude. The local bakery started sending day-old pastries every Friday. The hardware store began leaving tool donations in a bin labeled "For the Library." Even the sheriff, who'd once joked about Elric playing Hobbit, dropped off a box of vintage novels with a note. My daughter loved these, thought they'd find a good home. Then one Saturday morning, Elric opened the door to find a small crowd gathered, not to mock but to help. Marnie was there, of course, with a basket of apples, but so was Dale from the hardware store, holding a roll of weatherproofing tape. A woman who ran the community garden brought seedlings for a small planter box. Two teenagers, neither of whom had ever visited before, offered to repaint the exterior. Elric stood on the steps, stunned. "We figured," Dale said, clearing his throat. "You've done enough on your own." They spent the day working together, sanding, painting, planting, organizing. No speeches, no fanfare. Just people showing up because they finally understood. This wasn't just Elric's dream. It belonged to all of them now. By sunset, the train car gleamed under a fresh coat of deep forest green. The new planter box overflowed with marigolds and lavender. The shelves were neatly arranged, and inside the air smelled like wood polish, herbs, and something harder to name, maybe hope. That night, as Elric sat with Switch on the steps, watching fireflies blink in the field, he realized something. He hadn't set out to build a library. He'd set out to build a quiet place, but in doing so, he'd accidentally built a community. Kids who used to eat lunch alone now met at the train. Parents exchanged numbers while waiting to pick up their children. Teachers stopped by just to say thank you. Even the town's stray cats had started napping on the sun-warmed roof. And through it all, Elric remained the steady center. Not a leader, not a hero. Just a man who'd listened to a need no one else had named and answered it with his hands. One afternoon, a reporter from the county paper showed up. Not for a sensational story, but because her niece had started sleeping through the night after visiting the train. She asked if she could write a small piece. Elric hesitated. He didn't want attention. Didn't want it to become a spectacle. Just tell the truth, he said. No photos of the kids. No big words, just what it is. The article ran the next week under a simple headline, "A quiet place on the edge of town." It didn't go viral. It didn't make national news, but it brought a few more visitors. Parents from nearby towns, teachers looking for ideas, even a social worker who asked if she could bring a group of foster kids for a story hour. Elric said yes. And so, on a crisp October Saturday, 10 children sat cross-legged on the floor of the train car while Marnie read The Velveteen Rabbit in her warm, steady voice. Switch lay in the middle like a furry island. Elric stood by the stove, pouring cups of apple cider, watching as faces softened, shoulders relaxed, and for a little while, the world outside didn't matter. No one laughed anymore. They listened, and in that listening, something rare and real took root. A place where being quiet wasn't weakness, where needing space wasn't strange, and where a rusted train car could become a harbor for hearts learning how to feel safe again. Winter came soft that year, like a held breath. Frost painted the windows of the train car each morning, and the wood stove glowed red from dawn until long after dark. Inside, the air stayed warm and smelled of cinnamon, old paper, and the faint, clean scent of pine from the small tree Elric had brought in and propped in the corner. A gift from a kid who said, "Every library needs a Christmas tree, even if it's not December." By now, the train car wasn't just a place people visited, it was part of the town's rhythm. Kids arrived after school with snow dusting their jackets, shaking it off before stepping inside like they were entering a sacred space. Parents dropped off thermoses of hot chocolate. Teens who once loitered at the gas station now volunteered to shovel the path or stack firewood. Even the stray cats had claimed spots near the stove, curling into furry commas on the warm floor. But the real change wasn't just in daily habits. It was in how people saw each other. At the grocery store, strangers asked, "How's the library holding up in this cold?" At the post office, someone left a box of wool socks labeled, "For cold toes in the reading nook." A local artist painted a mural on the side of the tool shed Elric had built, a train winding through mountains, stars trailing from its smokestack, and tiny figures waving from the windows. No one had asked her to. She just showed up one Saturday with brushes and paint and said it needed color. Then came the documentary. A filmmaker from the city, quiet, unassuming, with kind eyes and a camera that never felt intrusive, had heard about the train library through a friend of Marnie's. She didn't come with a crew or bright lights, just herself, a small camera, and a promise. "I won't make it flashy. I just want to show what's real." Elric was wary at first. He'd seen how stories got twisted, how quiet things got turned into noise for clicks and views. But the filmmaker didn't push. She sat on the steps for 3 days, just watching. She filmed Switch greeting kids, the steam rising from mugs, hands turning pages, snow falling on the roof. She interviewed no one without permission. When she spoke to Elric, she asked only one question. "Why did you do this?" He looked out the window at the field, white and still, and said, "Because someone needed it. Maybe me, maybe them, maybe both." The short film aired months later on a local arts channel. It had no music, no dramatic narration, just the sound of wind, pages turning, laughter muffled by snow. It ended with a shot of the train car at dusk, lantern light glowing in the windows, smoke curling from the stovepipe into the cold air. The title card read, "The Quiet Place That Grew." It didn't go viral. It didn't need to, but it reached the right people. Donations trickled in, not huge sums, but enough. A new solar panel, a set of noise-canceling headphones, a box of art supplies. A retired librarian mailed her entire collection of children's classics with a note. "These books raised me. Let them raise others." Still, Elric kept things simple. He didn't open a website, didn't start a GoFundMe. He believed the magic was in the smallness, in the fact that this place existed without fanfare, without performance. It was real because it didn't try to be anything else. Then, something unexpected happened. The town council, the same group that had once debated whether Elric's train car was a public nuisance, called a meeting. Not to shut it down, but to discuss its future. Rumors had started that the land it sat on might be sold to a developer. The owner, an old farmer who'd mostly forgotten he owned that patch of scrub, had been approached with an offer. Panic rippled through the community. Parents spoke up at school board meetings. Kids wrote letters. Marnie organized a petition that gathered over 300 signatures in a week. Even Dale from the hardware store showed up at the council meeting in a clean flannel shirt, something he hadn't done since his daughter's wedding. Elric didn't ask for help. He never would have. But the town wouldn't let him face it alone. The night of the council meeting, the community center was packed. People stood in the back, sat on windowsills, spilled out into the hallway. When Elric walked in, wearing his least holy jacket, Switch at his heels, the room fell quiet. Not out of awkwardness, but respect. One by one, people stood to speak. A mother talked about how her son, who used to have panic attacks before school, now woke up calm because he knew he had a place to reset. A teacher described a student who'd written his first full essay after reading a book from the train's Stories That Feel Like Hugs shelf. A teenager, Leo, stood and said, voice shaking slightly, "Before the train, I thought I was just trouble. Now I fix things, I help, I matter." Then Marnie rose. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just spoke plainly, like she used to in front of her fifth-grade class. "We laughed when he bought that train car," she said, looking around the room. "We thought he was foolish. But sometimes the quietest people build the loudest hope. This isn't just a train. It's a heartbeat. And if we lose it, we lose something we didn't even know we needed until it was here." When it was Elric's turn, he stood slowly. He didn't have notes. Didn't look at the council members. He just spoke to the room. "I didn't build this to be famous," he said. "I built it because I remembered what it felt like to have nowhere quiet to go. If this place helps even one kid feel seen, then it's worth every splinter, every cold night, every doubting look. I don't need a medal, I just don't want it to disappear." He sat down. The room stayed silent for a long moment. Then someone clapped. Then another. Soon the whole room was applauding, not for show but from the heart. The vote was unanimous. The council offered Elric a permanent plot of land right next to the community center, flat, accessible, with room to grow. They'd even run electricity and water if he wanted it. No rent, no strings, just a home for the train, for good. After the meeting, people gathered around him, shaking his hand, hugging him, ruffling Switch's ears. Elric didn't say much. He just nodded, eyes glistening, and whispered, "Thank you," over and over. That weekend, the whole town helped move the train car. It wasn't easy. The old rails were gone, the ground uneven, but neighbors brought tractors, trucks, ropes, and muscle. Kids carried tools. Elders directed traffic with folding chairs and thermoses. Even the sheriff showed up in his work boots, rolling up his sleeves. It took 2 days, but they got it done. Carefully, slowly, like moving something precious. They set it down on a bed of gravel, surrounded by young saplings someone had donated. A small path of stepping stones led to the door. Someone hung a wooden sign above the entrance, carved by hand. "The Wayfarer's Library. All are welcome." Inside, everything stayed the same. The shelves, the nook, the stove, the string lights. But now it sat in the heart of town, not on the edge, and that made all the difference. With stability came new ideas. Elric started Story Sundays, quiet afternoons where anyone could come read aloud or just listen. Marnie hosted poetry hours. A local musician brought her guitar and played soft folk songs while kids drew. The space began to breathe in new ways but never lost its soul. And Elric? He started thinking bigger, not for himself but for others. He'd been quietly restoring a second train car he'd found abandoned near an old depot. This one was smaller, rounder, with curved windows and a dome roof. While the first train was for quiet and reading, this one he decided would be for making, art, music, messy, joyful creation. He called it the studio car. He didn't do it alone this time. Leo helped with the wiring. Tessa painted the interior walls in soft blues and yellows. Maya designed a logo, a compass inside a book, and stenciled it near the door. The whole thing became a group project, a promise that the kindness wouldn't stop with one space. Donations poured in: easels, clay, musical instruments, fabric scraps. A retired art teacher offered to lead weekly workshops. A sound engineer from the next town over volunteered to help set up a simple recording corner for kids who wanted to tell stories or sing. Elric watched it all unfold with quiet awe. He hadn't planned this. He'd just planted a seed and the whole town had watered it. One evening, as he sat on the new porch, built wide enough for 2 rocking chairs, he looked out at the path leading to the train. A mother walked her child home hand in hand. 2 teenagers lingered by the herb garden, laughing softly. Switch lay at his feet, older now, grayer around the muzzle, but still alert, still proud. Marnie joined him, handing him a mug of tea. "You did it," she said. He shook his head. "We did?" she smiled. "You started it." That counts, he didn't argue. He just watched the lantern light flicker in the windows of the train, now glowing like a lighthouse in the gathering dusk. The laughter that once echoed behind his back was gone. In its place was something deeper: trust, belonging, quiet pride. The town hadn't just accepted the train library. They'd claimed it as their own. And in doing so, they'd reminded each other what community really meant. Showing up, not because you have to, but because someone you care about needs you to. And Elric? He finally felt like he belonged too, not as the odd man in the train, but as the quiet builder of a place where everyone, no matter how lost or loud or silent, could find a little peace. The train wasn't going anywhere, and neither was he. Years passed, not with fanfare, but with the steady rhythm of seasons turning and small hands growing into capable ones. The train car, now polished, painted in deep forest green with gold lettering that caught the morning sun, sat under a pergola draped in wisteria, its purple blossoms dropping soft petals onto the path below. It wasn't just a library anymore. It was a landmark, a heartbeat, a place people pointed to when giving directions. Turn left after the train. Elric was older now, his hair more salt than pepper, his hands rougher but still steady. He still lived in the loft above the books, though he'd added a proper bed, a small desk, and a window that opened to the stars. Switch was gone peacefully on a spring morning, curled up in his favorite spot by the stove, but his memory lived in every child who patted the cushion where he used to sleep. In the framed photo on the shelf, in the way Elric still left a bowl of water by the door, just in case. But Elric wasn't alone. Far from it. The kids who once came seeking silence now brought their younger siblings, their cousins, even their own children. Tessa, who'd struggled with fractions, was studying to be an engineer and came back every summer to tutor. Leo ran a small repair shop in town and still stopped by every Friday to check the stovepipe and refill the firewood bin. Maya, once so quiet she barely spoke, now led writing workshops in the studio car, helping teens put their feelings into poems and stories. The Wayfarer's library had become a living thing, growing not through grand plans but through daily acts of care. Volunteers rotated shifts, retirees reading aloud on Tuesdays, high schoolers shelving books on Thursdays, parents hosting tea and talk afternoons for kids who just needed someone to listen. No one was paid. No one needed to be. They came because they remembered what this place had given them. And Elric, he'd begun to step back. Not because he was tired, but because he trusted others to carry it forward. He trained a small team of regulars to manage the day-to-day, opening the door, lighting the stove, welcoming visitors. He still showed up every morning, sweeping the floor, watering the herbs, checking the shelves, but he no longer felt like the only one holding it together. The community had become its keepers. The studio car, once just a dream in his notebook, now hummed with life. On any given afternoon, you might hear a guitar being tuned, the scratch of charcoal on paper, or the soft clink of clay being shaped on a wheel. A retired music teacher held sound circles where kids could try instruments without judgment. A local potter taught hand-building classes. Even the town's mayor, a quiet woman who'd once been a foster kid, herself donated a set of drums after her son found his voice through rhythm. What started as one man's quiet act of rebuilding had become a network of safe spaces, each one echoing the same truth. You don't have to be loud to matter. You don't have to perform to belong. Then came the anniversary. Not the 1st or the 5th, but the 10th. The town didn't plan a parade or a speech. They knew Elric wouldn't want that. Instead, they gathered quietly like they always did on a warm September evening. Strings of lights were hung between the two train cars. Folding chairs appeared on the grass. Someone brought a potluck. Homemade pies, roasted vegetables, jars of lemonade. Kids ran barefoot chasing fireflies. Elders sat in the shade watching with soft smiles. Elric stood near the steps wearing his least worn flannel, watching it all unfold. He didn't say much. He never did. But his eyes said everything. Marnie handed him a plate. "Eat before it gets cold," she said, echoing the words she'd spoken a decade ago when she first brought him soup. He smiled. "You always show up with food. And you always show up with hope," she replied. As dusk settled, the crowd grew still. No one announced it. They just knew. One by one, people began to share, not grand speeches, but small stories. A teenager talked about how writing in the studio car helped her process her parents' divorce. A boy who'd once hidden under tables during fire drills now read a poem he'd written about feeling brave. A mother thanked Elric for giving her son a place where he didn't have to explain why he needed quiet. No one mentioned the early days, the laughter, the doubt, the bets on how long he'd last. Those memories had faded like old paint, replaced by something stronger. When it was Elric's turn, he didn't stand. He just leaned against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, and said, "I didn't build this for thanks. I built it because I remembered what it felt like to have nowhere to land. If this place helped even one person feel seen, then it was worth every splinter, every cold night, every moment I thought I was crazy." He paused, looking out at the faces. Familiar, changed, full of light. "But it wasn't just me. You all built it too. Every book you donated, every hour you volunteered, every time you chose kindness over judgment. That's what made this real." Then, without another word, he walked over to the reading nook, sat down, and opened a book. The signal was clear. The evening wasn't about him. It was about the space, the stories, the quiet joy of being together. And so, under the stars, the town read aloud. Marnie started with a passage from The Little Prince. A child followed with a story about a dog who saved a train. Leo read a poem he'd written about fixing things: engines, fences, hearts. Maya shared a short piece titled The Day I Spoke, and though her voice trembled, she didn't stop. Switch's old cushion sat empty, but no one forgot him. A little girl placed a dandelion on it, whispering, "For the good dog." Later, as the fireflies blinked and the wisteria released its evening scent, Elric sat on the steps with a cup of tea, watching kids flip through pages with focused calm. Some whispered, some sat in comfortable silence, some just watched the sky. He thought about the years, the loneliness, the doubt, the slow, stubborn belief that something good could grow from something broken. He thought about the nights he'd wondered if anyone would ever understand. And now here they were, not just understanding, but building on what he'd started. The next generation was already dreaming. Just last week, a group of middle schoolers had approached him with a sketch. A tiny treehouse near the creek, painted blue, with a sign that read, "The Quiet Branch." They wanted to build it themselves, using scrap wood and rope, and fill it with books and blankets. "Like the train," one said, "but in the trees." Elric had given them his old toolbox. Now, as the night deepened and the last of the lanterns glowed, he felt a familiar presence beside him. It was Leo holding 2 mugs. "Thinking about the next train?" Leo asked, nodding toward the field where a third rusted car sat under a tarp. Elric's newest project, meant for nature journals, birdwatching guides, and outdoor meditation. "Maybe," Elric said. "But slowly." "You've done enough," Leo said softly. Elric shook his head. "Not done. Just passing the hammer." And that was the truth. He wasn't trying to build an empire. He was planting seeds, quiet, simple, human seeds, and watching them grow in ways he never imagined. The town no longer laughed. They listened. They showed up. They cared. And in that caring, they'd healed parts of themselves they didn't even know were broken. As the last guest drifted home, carrying leftovers and borrowed books, Elric stayed. He banked the stove, checked the windows, and turned off the string lights one by one. Then he sat on the steps again, alone but not lonely, listening to the crickets and the soft rustle of leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, real this time, on the active line miles away. It echoed across the valley, long and low, like a lullaby for the night. Elric smiled. The train car wasn't going anywhere, and neither was the quiet hope it carried. It lived in every child who found their voice, every adult who remembered their own, and every heart that chose to build instead of break. And that was more than enough.